I had a couple videos lined up for you guys. Oh, one of them was Renegade Cut. There it is.
Eliminating poverty.
I don't want to watch
dream
Lindsey
of the
Graham.
world. Feeding, clothing, and sheltering every human being on the planet. Creating equitable communities and an equitable international community. Poverty and hunger are both part of everyday life in regions of the world often called developing nations. Previously called the Third World and now most commonly called the Global South. Not the geographic South, but instead the continents of Africa and South America, as well as regions like Central America and parts of Asia. In the Global North, we are fed a narrative that we, the rich nations, are developing the poor nations, and that it is through our aid and our guidance that the Global South can reach that dream of eliminating much of their poverty. Unfortunately for all of us, this is a fiction. Today, approximately 4.3 billion people, which is more than 60% of the world's population, live in crippling poverty, struggling to survive on less than the equivalent of what $5 per day can buy in the United States. Poverty is not decreasing worldwide at the rate that institutions like...
Yo, can you guys shut the fuck up about Fun Day died for this or whatever the fuck? God damn, dude. Why are you guys such fucking babies, man? Holy fucking shit. What is this? Yeah, I watched All Gas No Brakes already. If you want to go skim it, you can go back and skim it. I already watched Among Us tier list and my part in it as well.
Keyword. Make that pullout game weak.
Notice
You reached 20k and became too good for us? Dude, no. I reached 20k and want to utilize this opportunity to educate as many fucking people as possible instead of throwing on a fucking History Channel show. What the fuck is wrong with you, man? You're like... It's a great opportunity for 20,000 people to fucking get more enlightened about global politics, and you're like crying because I'm not watching 90 Day Fiancé. It's very frustrating. And not only that, but like the fucking president, it might die. Like... Yeah, of course I'm going to cover that round the clock. Jesus Christ.
The World Bank and the United Nations claim, and researchers and economists have begun to expose this narrative. The Global North is not developing the Global South. It is underdeveloping the Global South. Through manipulation of data, crushing debt traps, covert intelligence operations, military interventions, and a modification of age-old colonialism tactics, rich nations are keeping poor nations in their current state. And unless the entire economic system that maintains this inequality
That's why I'm
is
angry.
replaced, this relationship, this exploitation, will always continue. Why are some nations rich and some nations poor? In the Global North, those of us living a relatively comfortable life frequently offer simplistic and uninformed opinions. Maybe they don't work hard enough, some might offer. But the working poor in impoverished nations generally work long hours with few of the benefits received in richer nations. Even in the Global North, those struggling to make ends meet will tell you that it is not for lack of trying, and that they will often have to work multiple jobs with little time for rest. The poor work more, not less. Maybe, others might suggest, their values are backwards and institutions too corrupt. But placing the blame on internal culture and internal matters only ignores globalization, international trade, and other ways in which nations interact and make internal matters only a piece of the puzzle. Such an argument also betrays an arrogance about our culture, values, and religions being right, and an ignorance about the corruption that also exists in rich nations. Maybe, some might even suggest, poor nations simply have always been poor and always will be poor, offering a kind of fatalism in lieu of evidence and research. Simplistic answers to extremely complex questions can be comforting, but in order to grapple with why the world is the way it is, both a longer view of history and the consequences of modern-day global capitalism must be understood. 77,777,777. The The history of the Global South is a history of underdevelopment by the Global North. According to The Divide by Jason Hickel, if we rewind to about 1500, a very different story emerges. At that time, there was little difference between Europe and the rest of the world when it came to the living standards of ordinary people. In fact, people living in South America, India, and Asia were in many ways better off than Europeans. Life expectancy in England was between 32 and 34 years, and a dismal 15 for children born into working-class families. Evidence from China, Japan, and other parts of Asia suggests that people in these regions also lived longer, healthier lives than Europeans did. Japan enjoyed a life expectancy of 41 to 45, China between 35 and 40, and parts of Southeast Asia around 42. Asia exceeded Europe in transportation technology, better sanitation, public health systems, and nutritional standards. Europe in the year 1500 was emerging from the Dark Ages and depopulation due to the Black Plague. Massive population loss stunted development of the continent by annihilating their labor force and weakening their institutions. Partly because of this, Europe in 1500 only accounted for approximately 15% of.
They were getting fucking owned by rats while the same Arab and like Muslims that they look down upon were fucking inventing modern medicine, preserving ancient texts from the Greeks, and also what you would now know as algebra, mathematics, you know, that sort of stuff. It's not still salty, it's just that like the Western civilization, like defending the West mentality is so fucking backwards and so idiotic that it is deeply frustrating when fucking hogs like those Proud Boys that we were watching earlier turn around and act like, you know, this is it. Like that culture and civilization is not a product of all of our collective work, and that like Western civilization actually fucking came about on its own. It's idiotic. And I said algebra on purpose because it sounds like Al Jazeera or Al Qaeda. That's the joke.
The global gross domestic product. China and India together controlled 65%. So, what happened in the following centuries to completely rearrange the global economy? Much in the way that Europe suffered from depopulation in the 14th and 15th centuries, Africa, North America, and South America were depopulated by European conquerors in the 16th century through the 19th century, through slavery, executions, warfare, and control, all in the service of stripping resources from other nations, many of which prior to that time were not suffering from poverty. This was the world system of colonialism. Colonialism is a policy of conquering, stealing, and controlling a new territory, often from afar, and snatching power from the indigenous people, making them either second-class citizens or removing citizenry outright in favor of enslavement. Regions that were colonized suffered centuries of depopulation and dispossession of their resources. For example, between Christopher Columbus's arrival in 1492 and the early 1600s, Latin America's indigenous population shrunk by as much as 95%. If Europe's economy could be slowed for centuries from poor health standards and a loss of 30% of its population, imagine what losing nearly everyone could do to a region. By the early 1800s, a total of 100 million kilograms of silver had been stolen from Latin America and inserted into the European economy, first into Spain and then into the rest of Europe as payment on Spain's debts. Because Spain was indebted to other nations due to its expensive involvement in the Crusades, the riches of the New World flooded to Spain's creditors, eventually enriching much of Europe. In Africa, the continent was depopulated partly through warfare, but also through the rampant slave trade. European historians claim that at least 10 million African slaves landed alive in the Americas, Atlantic Islands, and Europe, but this is considered a low estimate and does not take into consideration the full impact of the slave trade. For example, the figure does not account for those who died in transit, or smuggled slaves, or those killed during the banditry of capturing slaves. Furthermore, this figure does not count the East African slave trade or the Arab slave trade. To maintain the extraction of wealth from the colonies, the rich nations kept the poor nations in a state of dependency. The rich nations assigned poor nations or regions a particular resource for extraction, such as tea or sugar. This created a kind of monoculture for each poor nation or region, now trapped in a locked economy and without the infrastructure for expansion. Colonization in Africa lasted longer than in many other regions, as approximately 90% of the continent was under European control even in the early 20th century. Prior to colonialism, Africa was advancing and progressing economically and politically. Had the Atlantic slave trade and colonialism never been imposed on Africa, its development almost certainly would not have stagnated. The global economy post-colonialism is still affected by colonialism, though. For example, the terms of trade were ruined, perhaps forever, for Africa, South America, and other regions. Their exports decreased relative to the prices of goods they imported, spending more to receive less. For another, worker wages remained low. Post-colonialism, the global north could still impose an unequal exchange on regions that they had only recently colonized and enslaved. Again from Jason Hickel. The fact that slavery was used up through the 19th century further contributed to downward pressure on wages, as workers had to compete with free labor. And why do poor countries have a comparative deficit of capital in the first place? Partly because they were plundered of precious metals, and partly because their colonizers forcibly destroyed local industries so that they would have no choice but to consume Western exports. Orthodox economic theory presupposes international inequalities as if they have always existed, but the historical record is clear that they were purposefully created. Inexpensive or free labor throughout the history of colonialism provided the capital for the Industrial Revolution in Europe. This allowed richer nations to develop and modernize in the 19th century, and prevented poor nations from doing the same for a long time. Defenders of the economic inequality that greatly favors the global north use rhetoric like, "that was then, this is now," to ignore the long-lasting consequences of colonialism, as well as how colonialism set up the current terms of unequal trade. And once again, these factors are introduced from external forces, not internal policy. Poor nations produce raw materials which are then exported to rich nations, which are then sold back to the poor nations. Historian Clifford Cobb explained it like this. One of the legacies of colonialism is that the poor countries of the Third World are continuing to export raw materials, and the countries of Europe and North America produce and export finished products. This stems from a process that was developed long ago, and the intention was to make sure that the countries of the Third World remained backward, and remained dependent, and are never able to develop. So to this day, they are continuing to survive on the export of raw materials. That has always been to the disadvantage of the countries exporting the raw materials, and it gets worse each year. In other words, independence did not produce complete liberation. Poor nations have their own political structure and laws, but they operate under an economic system that continues to make them dependent on rich nations. The goal of rich nations is to ensure that poor nations can never become rich enough to be competitors, must be stable enough to produce raw materials, but poor enough to keep those materials inexpensive. Much of this unequal relationship between the global north and global south is maintained through debt. Following the end of colonialism, the massive debts of the rich colonial powers were transferred to the newly formed independent nations. This was in violation of international law, but the new nations did not have the resources to contest this. The global north's solution was to make the global south even more subservient through new debts with high interest payments. With no other options, poor nations took out these loans and accrued further debt. In general, it works like this. A rich nation sees a resource in a poor nation that it requires, such as oil or raw materials for commodities. The rich nation then arranges a loan to that poor nation with the World Bank. The World Bank provides these loans under conditions such as forced privatization and agreements that will benefit the global north. Then, in order to pay off this enormous debt, the poor nation makes an agreement with the rich nation to sell that resource for very little. is a kind of debt trap. These debts give rich nations the power to impose policy on poor nations. A layman observer might object to this, claiming that rich nations provide foreign aid to poor nations. But the devil is in the details. Aid given to poor nations is vastly outnumbered by what is taken from poor nations. According to Global Financial Integrity and the Center for Applied Research at the Norwegian School of Economics, the Global South receives...
A couple things I wanted to mention about this is that, one, China, one of the few countries that has been able to get out of that same exploitative structure and is now a world power as a consequence of that, and also does that exact same thing themselves. One Belt, One Road initiative, and two, this is why I still criticize social democracies and mention that social democracies in Europe are not necessarily free of any sort of negative consequence, considering that they themselves also participate still to this day in that same kind of post-colonial exploitation of the third world, and not as a unwilling participant, such as the nature of capitalism, but directly keeps measures in place to continue on with that exploitation. And yes, I mean Norway and Sweden and all these other countries that most of us here in the United States look to with puppy dog eyes, with hopes that as U.S. leftists, maybe we will be as liberated as one day, when in fact their policies domestically might be decent for the people that live there to a certain degree. Of course, you can never fully eliminate poverty under a capitalist structure, but also those systems are still incredibly unjust and horrible for the third world. Or, in simpler terms, capitalism, more like crapitalism, am I right? Let's move on.
Receives approximately $2 trillion in all aid, investment, and income from abroad, but it loses approximately $5 trillion taken predominantly from the global north. Foreign aid is also conditional, not a gift, and the conditions are the continued unequal relationship with rich nations. David Sogi, author of Give and Take, What's the Matter with Foreign Aid, explained it like this. The usual insinuation is of unproductive and ungrateful welfare queens living high on northern generosity. That is an illusion. Foreign aid is a sideshow. Northern financial circuits gain from southern capital, whether looted or legitimately saved. So, what happens when a poor nation is fed up, tries to help its own people, or the people revolt against the current order? Rich nations step in and put a stop to it. The system of global capitalism is not simply the natural outcome of markets. It is the maintenance of the unequal relationship between the global north and global south, often by force. When a head of state or head of government is elected or assumes power in the global south, that ruler faces a secondary challenge outside of the governance of the people. They must also capitulate to the global north, endorse capitalism, and maintain the current unequal economic relationship and trade deal.
It's literally like when people say, I consent, and then the CIA says, I don't consent, and that's exactly what this is.
If they do not, there is a good chance that this ruler
I'm gonna
or
run an ad after the video.
will be overthrown, either directly by or with some assistance from rich nations, most prominently the United States. There is a long history of this. Following the completion of westward expansion in the 19th century, the U.S. faced a turning point and a new question. Should they be satisfied with the current level of wealth and territory, or expand its influence across the world? The United States' desire for expansion, influence, and control of other nations is an economic concern. not a desire to spread democracy. It almost always came down to money. Stephen Kinzer, author of Overthrow, explained it like this. By the end of the 19th century, farms and factories in the United States were producing considerably more.
I'm sorry. Did you like to vote for a democratic socialist in a fair and free election? Well, guess what? We don't like that, so fuck you. Or, I'm sorry, did you violently overthrow by way of a socialist revolution a autocratic military dictator who enslaved your population for generations? Well, I'm sorry, but that violent military dictator actually allowed us to take advantage of the plantations on your island and also the casinos, and therefore we don't like what you did there. We're just going to make sure you're no longer able to participate in the global economy. How do you like that? Oops, turns out you fucking suck because you're not allowed to participate in the global economy. So yeah, how do you like that? Why would you think that socialism could ever work? Sorry, sweaty. Or rather, the most common leftist meme: how many democratically elected socialist leaders do we have to kill before you recognize socialism does not work?
More goods than Americans could consume. For the nation to continue its rise to wealth, it needed foreign markets. They could not be found in Europe, where governments protected domestic industries behind high tariff walls. Americans had to look to faraway countries, weak countries, countries that had large markets and rich resources but had not yet fallen under the sway of any great power. Here are only a few examples of US-backed coups and interventions, as well as the economic concerns surrounding them. In 1949, the United States assisted in regime change in Syria. President Shukri al-Quwatli refused to allow the US-sponsored oil pipeline from Saudi Arabia through Syria and into Lebanon. The CIA had an asset on the inside, and with their help, Syria installed Husni al-Zaim, who approved the oil pipeline and began rounding up left-wing opposition. In 1953, the United States assisted in regime change in Iran. Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized the oil industry, stripping away operations.
I love this. Oh, never mind. It's literally describing exactly what the United States did. Oh, I'm sorry. You want to control your own... Hold on, let me put it into terms you'll understand. In this circumstance, the United States literally pulled a Kyle Rittenhouse to go to someone else's property, someone else's private property, on someone else's soil to begin with, that was extracting someone else's natural resources, and to defend someone else's private property, they decided to do this.
From British oil corporations. Declassified CIA documents prove that the United States had a hand in Mossadegh's removal. Mossadegh spent the rest of his life under house arrest.
Isn't it a bit uncool to just let another video from another leftist creator play, thereby taking their views away from them? I mean, yeah, it's legal alone, perhaps a bit unethical. This is all you spammed? Sub for 2 months? This is all you spammed? Suck my dick.
In 1954, the United States assisted in regime change in Guatemala. President Jacobo Arbenz threatened holdings of U.S.-owned United...
Hey! Put that shit on BreadTube, motherfucker. Okay? Go put that shit on fucking BreadTube. If Renegade Cut or Second Thought or any number of these brilliant content creators whose videos I watch to gigantic fucking audiences that previously did not know, if they have any sort of problem with me, they can absolutely tell me and I'll never watch their videos ever again. Okay? You can cry for them, though, on behalf of them. Half the time when I watch leftist content creators on here, I personally know them, or they know me personally. They appreciate that I watch their videos. Same with All Gas, No Brakes, for example. Okay? A lot of people find out about these content creators from watching these videos, and then they turn around and they go and watch the rest of their library. There's plenty of people who are probably talking about Second Thought and Renegade Cut and how they found out about it from watching this channel.
Pervert.
And the content creators themselves understand that reality and therefore do not have a problem with that at all. I just wanted to make sure that everybody fucking understands what the situation is here. Okay? Stupid fuck. I can't. You know what? I'm gonna run an ad too. Fuck, because I have to. While I'm fucking stun locked. You put me on 3 arrows. Yeah, I'm like friends with these people too. That's another thing. You're overreacting, bro. No, I'm not. I despise annoying little woke scold fucks who think that they are leftier than thou and have absolutely zero fucking, like, zero skills in comprehending how personal relationships work, how anything works. It's just there to virtue signal. Okay? That person writes that just to fucking exclusively virtue signal and show everyone else in the chat
You're such a big man,
that he
Hassan.
is super woke and he thought about something that no other content creator had thought about. You damage the left. You hurt the
His name is
leftist
Hassan.
reputation. You make it harder to build a coalition. And I despise your opinions when you behave this way. That's why I'm extremely critical of people like this and literally take the time out and belittle them in front of thousands of people, almost to the same degree that I belittle right-wing chuds. You deserve to be belittled.
Fruit company.
This is a deranged
The CIA equipped paramilitary troops and the U.S. Navy blockaded the coast. The president was removed from power, leaving the nation run by a succession of military juntas. In 1960, the United States and Belgium ousted Congo's Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba. Belgium wanted to maintain its business interests in the region after decolonization. Lumumba was killed in 1961. In 1964,
Using the term woke scold weird champ. Does anybody else want some?
the United States helped oust Brazilian President João Goulart, whose left-wing politics threatened capitalism. In 1973, the United States backed a military coup against democratically elected President Salvador Allende, who was a socialist, in favor of the dictatorship of Augusto
I'm a
Pinochet.
fascist. I am the fascist. Okay? Here? Right here? This is off left all the way. You understand? Think about it as though this is a Stalinist dictatorship. Not a dictatorship of the proletariat. Okay?
A fascist capitalist who was responsible for countless atrocities. There are a great many more, including Vietnam, Indonesia, Ecuador, Laos, Iraq, all of which were carried out for the same reason as the debt traps and exploitation of raw materials, to maintain the relationship between rich nations and poor nations. If a poor nation wants to abandon capitalism, or if a poor nation threatens rich nations with competition, that is when the CIA resorts to covert regime change. If poor nations want to exist, they are forced to accept the terms of rich nations. If poor nations want to do more than simply exist, but actually flourish, they are violently crushed, and a more compliant head of state is installed by rich nations. In other words, there is no way out of poverty for poor nations, so long as rich nations purposefully keep them indebted and subservient.
This is a deranged...
To propagate the myth that wealthy capitalist nations are greatly reducing poverty and that we should allow them to continue doing whatever they want, the World Bank occasionally releases data that shows global poverty gradually decreasing. It is the lie that we have been told for years, but recently, independent economists and researchers have begun to publicize critiques of this data and have largely proven that global poverty is either stagnant or increasing, depending on whether one is calculating using percentages or total numbers. The most well-read critique might be Jason Hickel's calculation in The Divide. Here is the more accurate data from this book. In terms of absolute numbers, the original metric
How did China? Someone asked, how did China how was China able to not get cucked while all these other nations got cucked? Well, part of the reason why China didn't get cucked was because their natural resource that the rest of the world was exploiting is their labor force. They use their own labor force as though it's a fucking...
Make that pullout game weak.
As though it's a... I mean, they had just too many fucking people. And they were like, who gives a fuck? We'll throw people at the problem. Also, the other part about that was... No, it's not just that we underestimated China. What happened is China utilized, and this is something I say about Bernie Sanders, something I say about fucking people all the time. China utilized the biggest weakness that capitalist nations have against them, which is their never-ending interest for profit. They were able to be like, yeah, we're going to steal your fucking IP, but we'll throw human slaves at you. And we will redistribute and take all of the wealth that we secure from that and not necessarily redistribute it to the people immediately, but redistribute it by building infrastructure and bringing the entire bringing the entire country together, like uplift rural areas, okay, and move the rest of the country, move the entirety of the country from a agrarian society to a fully industrialized nation. They utilized all power of the state in the best possible way you could. Actually, Stunlock, no, this is pretty important. I think that this is a good example of how you can describe how a state exploited its own citizens as a infinite natural resource, like a constantly growing natural resource, and they were able to steal all the IP as a consequence of that, and start making their own product that was even more competitive. They did a great job by using the insatiable appetite that capital owners had against them to become a competitive power player in the global marketplace. China also has nukes and is a permanent member of the UN Security Council along with the UK, US, France, and Russia. They've been designated as a superpower for a long time. I don't think it's a realistic comparison to the third world countries of the global south. That's fair as well.
This is a deranged.
And I distracted with something totally irrelevant but pretty neat quickly. Also, can we chill tonight? Dude, hold on. Let me finish this because everyone's fucking crying about it.
By which the world's governments agree to measure progress, the numbers show that the poverty headcount is exactly the same now as it was when measurements began back in 1981, at approximately 1 billion people. Of course, this is only according to the lowest possible poverty lines established by organizations like the World Bank and the United Nations. The International Poverty Line, instituted by the World Bank, is a measurement of $1.90 per day. $1.90 is the international equivalent of what that amount can buy in the United States. Researchers are now saying that people need at least $5 per day just in order to have a good chance of surviving until their 5th birthday, having enough food to eat, and reaching normal life expectancy. If we moved the poverty line to this more accurate level, we would see a total poverty headcount of over 4 billion people. That is most of humanity. Poverty has become worse over time, with more than 1 billion people added to the ranks of the poor since 1981. So, how did the...
Guys, with this one simple trick, we uplifted the entire world out of global poverty. And what was that one simple trick? Oh, to just deny what the accurate level of global poverty should be like. Or should be. Come on, guys. Extreme poverty versus poverty. Come on. Will, I just DM'd you on Discord. Why are you not replying? Anyway.
World Bank and the United Nations get away with misleading figures that show the opposite. The World Bank wants to present the case that privatization and capitalism in general are making the world better, and that their efforts specifically are causing a net positive for the world, particularly the global south. It's in their best interests to show the rosiest possible narrative. Their institutional power and authority afford them a kind of leeway among the press and among the people. So much, in fact, that they can perform statistical manipulation that is uncritically swallowed. Why is the IPL so low despite reams of evidence and a call to adjust it to much higher? Because if the World Bank made the IPL accurate, it would reveal that their debts, conditions of privatization, and such were unhelpful. Their calculations are not in error, they are just using the wrong numbers to begin with. Over the past couple decades, every time bad news about poverty would come out of statistics from the World Bank, they would change the IPL or other measurements shortly thereafter and claim that the bad news from just a few days ago is now retroactively false based on their new numbers. It's the global equivalent.
To refute that chatter, India is richer in gross terms than most of the world, including Italy, Turkey, Russia, and yet they're still global south. What do you think? How much do you think is an active effort like the video claims, or just very strong bias internally and actually believing what they say? No, it's a fucking active effort 100% to justify continued exploitation by loan sharking the third world in the simplest terms possible. Of course it's a fucking deliberate effort. And part of that is white supremacy. Being careless in the way that you fucking talk about or deal with the global south is white supremacy. Does China loan shark African countries? Yes, now they do. Also, that's not a justification for the devastation that Western nations have caused on China. Okay? Or not China, fucking Africa, sorry. Well, I guess China as well to a degree, but Africa. It's so weird to uncritically and without a single fucking thought or care be like, bro, China's doing this too, especially when they're doing this to a much lesser fucking extent than what we have done for centuries, and to the degree in which we have colonized the world for centuries, and how much that played a role in our early development.
This is a deranged.
Which then which then still reinforces our global hegemony, like our global hegemonic power, because we early on were able to fucking colonize and take advantage and exploit and extract natural resources from fucking half the world. That allows us to maintain the level of power that we have. China becoming competitive by utilizing some of those exact same methods. Not to the same fucking degree, of course. And I'm talking about foreign policy. I'm not talking about China's domestic policy, because in my opinion, China's domestic policy is fucking horrible. It's dog shit, especially the way they treat Muslim Uyghurs, obviously. It's fucking disgusting. It's Nazi shit, nearly. Cultural genocide. Countries can say no to China and not get bombed. Also, the debt trap is disproven just by looking at these countries' debt loads. It's also productive debt. Okay, dude. Why do Terra Genome and like every fucking tanky unironically sounds like a neoliberal whenever they're justifying what China does to other countries? You're so ridiculous, dude. You sound literally like a fucking, like one of those dudes who has a globe on their fucking Twitter, like on their Twitter description, but for China. China is like neoliberalism. When you do that, it's like neoliberalism with Chinese aesthetics. Like, that's it. Chinese characteristics. So it's like neoliberalism, but with cool trains. And no freedom of information.
His name is Hassan.
Equivalent of putting a thumb on.
No, we don't need a tanky chud emote. You want to know why we don't need a tanky chud emote? Because there's like 8 of them, okay? There's like fucking 8 of them. 8 overall. And half of them fucking are delusional, and they get out of their like weird, super fucking hardline approach or uncritical approach to China. A comparison between China and the United States as superpowers is totally valid. But claiming that one side actually is doing well or doing good rather than it's doing less bad than America is insane. I'm sorry. Is China doing less evil overall than the United States, especially with its loan sharking policies? Certainly. Because there hasn't been a point where, or at least yet,
Excuse me. I'm sorry. I'm out of
where
control.
we've seen China try to collect its debts from a nation that is not interested
help other people if what they are doing will inherently make them less
or
well
incapable. China's not a selfless or a socialist paradise, but it's contributing to the development of the economies of many African countries in a way the West hasn't. Don't you literally learn about the exploitation of the global South on basic political science course? I'm confused why people need to be babied through this, because a lot of people here have never been interested in politics and are interested in politics right now. They're doing exactly what the U.S. does in Africa. That's not true.
This is a deranged pervert.
Thank you, Hassan.
What the fuck is cultural genocide? Disgustingly contrived term by U.S. propaganda apparatus. Okay, let's use less propagandized terms then, like re-education camps. Is that better for you? Throwing fucking, first of all, having an insane surveillance state on like 10 million Muslim Uyghurs and then locking them up in fucking re-education camps. Is that better? That's a pretty good way to fucking describe it, in my opinion. Peak lib talk, peak lib take. Suck my dick, peak lib take. Yeah, guess what, dude? First of all, you're wrong. Liberals unironically don't fucking have a problem with China because they do business with China, okay? Secondly, China still has more billionaires per capita in their political party than any other fucking country on the planet. And lastly, but I'm sure one day they're gonna fucking totally expropriate, dude. Like, it's gonna happen. I mean, eventually, bro, please, bro, trust me, bro. It's gonna happen, bro. I swear, bro. Meanwhile, bro, come on. It's not a concentration camp, bro. Come on, dude. You're crazy. They're just Muslim separatists that need to be dealt with violently, right? But also, you hate imperialist scum in America KKK, right? When they do that, because you have a hammer and sickle in your fucking description on Twitter, and you think America KKK needs to be disbanded as an imperialist colony. It needs to be decolonized immediately. We need to do everything we can, comrades. But then also fucking when China does it, oh, dude, they're fucking Muslim separatist powers that absolutely have to be dealt with. I mean, come on.
Scales.
It's like, I love different opinions, okay? I love difference in opinions, especially when it comes to this sort of stuff.
Oh, you're
but
such a big
the fucking
banana,
really
son.
annoying thing to me, especially, is like, look, there's a way to look at different nations and all the horrible fucking things that they've done. There's a different way to look at, there's a different way to look at America and other countries and like maybe even compare the death and devastation on American metrics and American terms, in which most nations turn into like fucking literal peaceful doves, barring like literal genocide. Okay? But one thing that is always annoying that I see demonstrated by so many fucking 17-year-old anarchitties and, well, not anarchitties, but they're annoying for different reasons. 17-year-old fucking tankies is like unironically siding with other foreign nations in an uncritical manner exclusively because you fucking hate America. And half the time you're on the right side of history because America is that bad, right? But then in other circumstances you come across like a fucking idiot.
What can I do after learning how mean we are to the world? I feel bad learning about the global south, but I am glad I am learning.
But maybe it's because I just, haven't read enough or something. I don't know. It probably is that. It probably is because I haven't read enough theory to fully understand, fully comprehend Dengi's thought.
But that's not all. The United Nations also presents this rosy narrative to give the impression that the global economy is on the right track. It may be for the global north, but not so much for the global south. They began this data analysis in 2000 with their Millennium Development Goals. They do this manipulation in several ways. First, they changed the measurement of poverty from absolute numbers to proportional numbers, allowing for the appearance of less suffering over time due to population growth. The moral calculus of this is appalling because it implies that even if there is more and more suffering throughout the world, so long as the population of less impoverished people keeps growing, the increasing number of poor people can be seen as decreasing. Second, to manipulate the data further, the UN moved the starting point from 2000, when they actually began doing things, to 1990 to take advantage of gains made prior to when they even started the program. They did this to take credit for massive improvement on poverty in China during the 90s, and to add those figures to their data. The reason this is so disingenuous is that the United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund cannot claim to be responsible for improvement in poverty in China. China, and a few other nations in that region, are some of the only places in the world where free market capitalism was not forcibly imposed by the World Bank and the IMF. China was not subject to the structural adjustment imposed on the Global South. In other words, our current economic system has not made the Global South better. It has made it worse. And the only nation...
I will concede to Chinese global hegemony when the American labor unions are so horrifically eviscerated and so corrupt that Chinese factories can come back and actually make a profit purely, even if it's purely for marketing efforts to normalize relations with the United States. But the American labor force is so undermined that China can come back to the United States and build factories and start exploiting our labor force. Wait. Hold on. If only there was a president who was taking credit for doing that. That's Obama and Donald Trump, baby. Both of our past two administrations have done exactly that.
Nations mostly immune to the machinations of the World Bank and IMF are communist nations in Asia. The data presented by the World Bank and the United Nations has consistently been proven false in recent years, but an uncritical media that loves the rosy narrative will still sometimes reprint this misleading data without calling it into question. This might seem obvious, but it apparently needs to be said. The watchdog for the World Bank cannot be the World Bank. Global capitalism is a complex system.
Wow, what is this libtard saying? I don't understand. Self-policing systems work so perfectly, i.e. just look at the fucking American police force. Wrong, sweaty.
And we are not all economists. Perhaps this can all be better understood if the machinations of global capitalism can be compared to the more accessible daily life of an individual. A layman observer might wonder why the Global South participates in this obvious debt trap. But the answer is the same for why an individual labors under the thumb of a corporation, because that individual has no choice. The relationship between rich nations and poor nations is not dissimilar from the relationship between a rich individual and a poor individual within a nation. That individual, like everyone under capitalism, is being exploited for their labor. That individual will always produce far more for the corporation than they will ever receive from the corporation. But there are bills to pay, a family to feed, and that individual is forced to participate in their own exploitation until the system is abolished and replaced completely. A layman observer might also wonder how rich nations that fund rebellions and stage coups in poor nations could get away with this violation of international law so consistently if it is so terrible. The answer is the same for why an individual can be subjected to state violence within their...
My man said international law, dude!
His name is Hassan.
It's not the Geneva Convention, it's the Geneva Suggestion. International law is only there so that Western superpowers can use it as a justification to invade smaller nations that have natural resources that they would like to extract. Oftentimes while violating that same exact fucking international law. International law, more like inshallah. Yeah. There is no such thing as international law for the United States of America. Perhaps the greatest example of this is a Bush-era act called the Invasion of the Hague Act that dictated in the aftermath of the Iraq invasion. If the International Criminal Court ever tried to charge and prosecute a single American service member, a diplomat, or anyone that was involved in doing American war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan, then they would invade the motherfucking Hague. That's how much we care about international law, dude.
Their own nation, even when it is blatantly illegal and immoral, because this violence is protected and enshrined in a culture as being for some greater good. It is not exactly one-to-one, but hopefully that will make things clearer. What is happening internally within a nation is also happening in a grander scale externally, and it has been happening for a very long time. Hi everyone. If you want to learn more, the sources are in the description, as usual. Most of the sources were cited in
This is very good.